Thank you, Günther, and welcome, Yaron. Glad to have you with us. And welcome to everyone who's tuning in as well. We can all look forward to a very, very well-informed and interesting and highly pertinent discussion about anti-Semitism in Russia. As we all know, some of us, in fact, are descendants of Russian Jews. Russia at one point had a very, very large Jewish population. Its descendants now live all over the world, large numbers of them in North America, Europe, Israel, and so on. And our guest today, Yaron Gamburg, himself began life in that part of the world. He was born in Zhytomyr, Ukraine, and grew up with both languages, Russian and Ukrainian, and retains them to this day and works very well and easily in both languages, as well as English and Hebrew, and I'm not sure what else, but I wouldn't stop right there. The special focus of his work is, in fact, on Russian anti-Semitism. He's doing a PhD at a major university in Paris, France, on that very subject. He also looks hard at the discourse on the Holocaust in today's Russia, which ties in directly to the subject. Um, Yaron is a research associate at INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, arguably the leading research institute in Israel. While doing his PhD in Paris, he's living right now in this country with his wife and children. In the past, he was stationed in Israeli diplomatic service in Moscow, Paris, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. In other words, we're meeting today with a highly well experienced, very knowledgeable scholar of his subject. Yaron, it's now my pleasure to turn over to you. We look forward to your talk.
Good morning, Elvin, and thank you for this nice introduction. I really would like to be up to your expectations. And thank you, of course, to Gunter for this opportunity to be with you and your esteemed audience. So good morning to everyone. Today, we will explore a troubling yet very significant topic, which is the resurgence of anti-Semitism in contemporary Russia and how it fits into a long historical trajectory. The title of this lecture suggests that what we are witnessing today is not new. It is a return to old patterns shaped by modern geopolitical realities. So we will discuss, there will kind of three chapters. The first, we will talk about the recent surge of anti-Semitic rhetoric and its connection to Russia's war with Ukraine. We also discuss later the relations between Russia and Israel and the impact on it of October 7 Hamas attack, relations between Russia and Israel, but of course also the situation of anti-Semitism in Russia. And at the end, we will look at the role of anti-Semitism in Kremlin's political strategy, specifically also discussing Putin's Jewish dilemma, as I call it. So let's start. In recent weeks, we have witnessed just another round of anti-Semitic rhetoric from the highest levels of the Russian government. First, during his annual end-of-year press conference on December 19, Russian President Putin stated that the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine was being torn apart, I quote, and he implicated that ethnic Jews were responsible for this. So it was in December, and in March, just a few days ago, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made an even more shocking statement, calling Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a pure Nazi and a traitor to the Jewish people. Now, these statements are absolutely normal in today's Russia's discourse. While anti-Semitic themes have long been present in Russian propaganda, now they are openly endorsed at the highest levels of government. The normalization of anti-Semitic discourse in Russia has occurred at a speed unimaginable. Just think about it. Back in January 2016, in the meeting with the delegation from the European Jewish Congress, President Putin invited European Jews to return to Russia, presenting it as a safe haven. But only 6 years later, already in 2022, Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, a very well-known rabbi who was the chief rabbi of Moscow, he urged Russian Jews to leave the country as soon as possible, warning that the Russian government's search for scapegoats, this is what he said, the search for scapegoats given the Russia's military failures in Ukraine would lead to increased anti-Semitism. Now, what actually happened is that between the years 2022 2023, we saw a sharp rise in a Jewish immigration from Russia. In 2022, about 43,000 Jews moved to Israel from Russia. It was six times more than in 2021. And in 2023, there was another 33,000 Jews and their families, members of their families, who left Russia. Now, it's important to understand that this exodus was not just about anti-Semitism. It was part of a broader wave of immigration that was triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and also by military mobilization and economic instability in the country. So many professionals, Jews or not Jews, IT specialists, journalists, artists, and those groups of population where Jews were well represented, they left Russia to escape conscription and new wave of repressions. That's exactly what happened in Russia. So my main argument today will be that despite Putin's past efforts to present himself as a friend of the Jewish people, his recent embrace of ultra-nationalist and imperialist ideologies has contributed to a revival of anti-Semitic rhetoric in Russia. And consequently, today in contemporary Russia, anti-Semitism expresses itself in three major domains, and we will discuss it right now. The first is foreign influence, which means manipulating anti-Semitism in global disinformation campaigns of Russia. And of course, part of it, very important part of it, is presenting Ukrainian government as anti-Semitic and neo-Nazi regime. Another domain is distortion of Holocaust memory, to using historical revisionism to serve geopolitical goals. And last but not least, domestic repression, because what we see is also singling out Russian Jews for their anti-war and anti-regime opinions. And all those aspects, in all those aspects, we can identify the heritage of Soviet policies. So, but first, let's turn to the war in Ukraine that served as a catalyst for this, I would say, weaponization of anti-Semitism and weaponization of the memory of Holocaust. The war in Ukraine marked a turning point in Russia's use of anti-Semitic rhetoric. President Putin's justification for the invasion included a so-called denazification of Ukraine, which is, of course, based on false claims that Ukraine was controlled by Nazi elements. This narrative included grotesque distortions of Holocaust history and also anti-Semitic statements by senior officials. In 2022 already, a few weeks after the beginning of the war, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov compared Zelensky to Adolf Hitler and argued that Hitler also had Jewish roots. There was also a top security advisor in the Council for Security Council of Russia who published an article where he, in a very well-known Russian newspaper, and he labeled the Jewish Chabad movement as a supremacist sect. And President Putin himself started to claim that Ukrainians and not Germans were primarily responsible for the Holocaust. Now, some of these statements and I must emphasize some of them, not all of them, provoked outrage from Jewish organizations, from the Israeli government. And initially, in the first year of war, Putin sought to smooth over tensions by distancing himself from Lavrov's remarks. He also spoke with the Israeli prime minister at that time, Naftali Bennett. But later, his own rhetoric became increasingly anti-Semitic. And while the anti-Semitism of his loyalists was usually denounced, his own remarks, anti-Semitic remarks, were never, and I emphasize this, never criticized by Israel or other countries or the Jewish organizations. Now, another anti-Israel gesture of the Russian government was shutting down the Jewish Agency in Russia. Jewish Agency is an organization responsible for Jewish immigration to Israel. The presence of the Jewish Agency in Russia had an important symbolic significance given the Soviet anti-immigration policies, because as a persecuted minority in the Soviet Union, in the USSR, Soviet Jews struggled for the right to immigrate from a country that discriminated against them. Now, today, the agency's operations in Russia have been effectively shut down. Uh, this did not mean, however, a halt to the Jewish immigration, as I already mentioned. But now this immigration is being organized through a private company. We can say an kind of an authorized partner of the Jewish agency. And this probably explains why, after initial negative reaction over the status of the Jewish agency, Israeli government official protests eventually, over time, subsided because I, from what we can see, it was because of the decision to work for easing tensions with Russia. In this context, by the way, it's also worth noting that from the very beginning of the war, Israel has not joined Western sanctions against Russia, refused to provide weapons to Ukraine, and insisted on its neutral position in the conflict. Now, as Russia suffered military setbacks in Ukraine, and as the domestic political situation became more unstable, I just remind you what happened um, in the second year of war with this rebellion by Yevgeny Prigozhin, just to give one example of this internal instability. With all this situation becoming more unstable, anti-Semitism reemerged more explicitly in official rhetoric. Putin himself, who previously cultivated a very pro-Jewish image, began singling out Jews who opposed the war in Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion and during first year of war, Putin restrained from anti-Semitic remarks. But in 2023, as Russia's difficulties on the battlefield against Ukraine mounted, he turned to anti-Semitic rhetoric. He called Zelensky a disgrace to the Jewish people. He mocked Russian citizens of Jewish origin, like Anatoly Chubais, one of the leaders of democratic transformation in Russia in the 1990s, suggesting that their Jewishness made them disloyal to Russia. He also implied that Jewish figures who opposed the war in Ukraine were acting against Russia's interest. So this rhetoric signaled a dangerous shift. Russia was no longer merely using anti-Semitism as an anti-Ukrainian tool, but was openly applying it to the Russian citizens as well. And now we will discuss a bit later the consequences of this rhetoric. Now, while the war in Ukraine was the first major trigger for Russia's anti-Semitic shift, another key turning point came with October 7 Hamas attack on Israel, because Russia's response on this attack was not one of condemnation, but of open hostility towards Israel and support for Hamas. Now, maybe just a few words about Russia's ties with Hamas. Originally, it was one of, I would say, mutual suspicion 25 years ago when President Putin launched a war against rebellious Chechen Republic, and Hamas leaders expressed tacit support of the Chechen cause. Kremlin was not among Hamas fans, but all this has changed over the years, and within hours of the October 7 attack, Hamas representatives contacted Russian officials who reportedly expressed support, and it was never denied by the Russian representatives. Now, also Hamas delegations visited Moscow before and after the attack, signaling strong ties between them. And of course, we know that Russia provided Hamas, for example, with license to manufacture AK-47 and ammunition in Gaza. So this is just a little introduction of the relations between Russia and Hamas. But what is important from the point of view of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel attitudes, in the first weeks after the attack of the October 7 attack, we witnessed how Russian propaganda intensified its anti-Israel stance. President Putin repeatedly commented on the Gaza war, and he compared the IDF actions, Israel Defense Forces actions, to the Nazi Wehrmacht, reviving, in fact, a central theme of Soviet anti-Israel propaganda. In one of his speeches, he compared the actions of the Israeli army in Gaza with the blockade of Leningrad, which is considered in Russia one of the Germany's most brutal war crimes. Um, Explaining the reasons for the attack, Putin accused the United States and called it the root of evil. And I quote, a spider that is trying to envelop the whole world in its web and wants to achieve our strategic defeat. This is a end of quote. So the image of the Zionist spider entangling the whole world in its web was widespread in Soviet and actually before that in Nazi propaganda, but Putin doesn't hesitate to use these images. Now, the Russian media embraced extreme anti-Israel narratives, portraying Israel as the aggressor, and pro-Kremlin social media accounts incited anti-Semitic hatred, which were echoing Soviet anti-Zionist campaigns. We also I should mention that from geopolitical point of view, the war in Gaza helped Kremlin in distracting global attention from the war in Ukraine, and also in promoting a narrative of the Western hypocrisy and double standards. It was also very useful from the point of view of Kremlin. Now, when it comes to the attacks, open public diplomatic attacks on Israel, I just would like to mention Russia's ambassador to the United Nations, Vasily Nebenzia, who rejected Israel's right to defend itself in the wake of Hamas attack. He argued that Israel's military action in Gaza are very illegal and claimed that Israel engaged in collective punishment rather than self-defense. And of course, so Russia aligned itself with anti-Israel forces in the United Nations. And in fact, Moscow led efforts to block resolutions condemning Hamas and simultaneously pushing for an unconditional ceasefire, effectively protecting the Hamas from military consequences of their actions. All of this one-sided and very biased accusations of Israel mirrored exactly the Soviet era propaganda, which often portrayed Israel as an aggressor and sought to delegitimize it. So we clearly see this similarity. Now, what's more is that the surge in anti-Israel rhetoric had immediate real-world consequences. In late October 2023, anti-Semitic riots erupted in Russia's North Caucasus region. I believe many of our participants of today's webinar remember those pictures that were distributed worldwide with the mobs who were storming hotels, searching for Jews. There was a synagogue in Nalchik that was set on fire. And in Makhachkala, which is the Dagestan's capital, thousands seized an airport hunting for Jewish passengers arriving from Tel Aviv flight. What is interesting is that the Russian government reaction was to downplay the severity of these incidents, and President Putin blamed Western intelligence services for provoking ethnic unrest. So there were some arrests that were made, but punishments were symbolic, and it all reflected the unwillingness of the Kremlin to crack down on anti-Semitic violence. Uh, Putin's rhetoric after the pogrom just further fueled hostility as he expressed solidarity only with the Palestinians and did not condemn the Hamas perpetrators of the attack. So to sum up, the developments since October 7 or after October, even aftermath of October 7 attack, there was this combination of official anti-Israel messaging, of encouragement of anti-Semitic propaganda by senior officials, including Putin himself, and of course government inaction, as in case of the events in North Caucasus, that created this environment where open anti-Semitic aggression was possible. Now, Russia positions on Israel also has undergone a radical shift because instead of having strategic and positive ties, there was an open hostility and alignment with anti-Israel forces, and this Russia's UN rhetoric and Hamas support, and including domestic anti-Semitic violence, they all point to some kind of re-Sovietization in a way of Russian foreign policy. And of course, this shift reflects Kremlin's return to Soviet-style anti-Semitic tactics, which in the 1970s and 80s were used to discredit Zionism and link it to Western imperialism. So we see those parallels between what happened then and what is happening, what has happened after October 7 attack. It's also important to mention maybe that beyond relations with Ukraine and Israel, Russia uses anti-Semitism to destabilize the West at large through influence operations. And just as the KGB spread anti-Semitic disinformation during the Cold War, today's Russian intelligence agencies use anti-Semitic narratives to sow division in Europe and the United States. I will just give you a few examples. In France, Russian agents were accused of painting stars of David on buildings in Paris to incite ethnic tensions. They also manipulated narratives around Gaza to polarize French society ahead of elections in 2024. Similar approach, by the way, was also seen in the US with Russian bots who were trying to fuel anti-Israel protests at American universities. And Kremlin-backed accounts promoted conspiracy theories about Jewish control of the US government. All these themes were very are familiar to us from the Soviet period. They are reminiscent of some Soviet era operations like Zarathustra, operation by the KGB, which were falsely accused West Germany, for example, of reviving Nazi anti-Semitism, or there was an operation Pandora by KGB, which incited racial tensions in the US. One of the more serious operations was Operation SIG, which in Russian is acronym for Zionist States, which in 1970s spread anti-Semitic disinformation in the Middle East, trying to portray Jews as the enemy of Arab nations and blame them for Western colonial policies. Back then, the goal was to radicalize Arab states against Israel and the United States. And we also saw a wave of Soviet-backed terrorist activity in the region against Israeli and Western sites. So if you are interested to learn more about Russia's exploitation of anti-Semitism for propaganda, I can suggest you very good reading. Good read is the U.S. State Department report from 2024 that elaborates on this subject and also gives this provide these parallels between what we see today and what we've seen in the past, in the Soviet past and even before. And all this brings us to the question of role of anti-Semitism in Russian strategy and Putin's endorsement of it. First of all, Russian actions should not seem surprising because they are part of a, unfortunately, very long history of Soviet and even pre-Soviet periods. And so Putin's period, which is extends over 25 plus years, should be put into some historical perspective. Even if we look at the pre-Soviet period, in late 19th century or early 20th century, the Russian Empire institutionalized anti-Semitism through pogroms, through the Pale of Settlement, through fabricated conspiracies like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was, by the way, forged by the secret services of Tsars. If you want, the KGB of Tsars, the Akhranka. Now, the Soviet period could be also divided in two, when in the beginning, the early Bolsheviks opposed anti-Semitism, Lenin included. But under Stalin, anti-Semitism was used as a political weapon. And by the end of Stalin's rule, the Jews were accused of cosmopolitanism, and of course, the most abhorrent expression of the anti-Jewish persecution was the infamous Doctor's Plot in 1952-53, which was a fabricated conspiracy accusing Jewish doctors of trying to kill Soviet leaders. After Stalin, the Soviet Union continued to aggressively promote anti-Zionist propaganda and implemented a policy of state anti-Semitism. Now, when it comes to Putin, there is a certain paradox. I mentioned this as a name, Putin's Jewish dilemma or paradox, because Putin initially presented himself as a friend of the Jewish people, friend of Israel, friend of the Jewish people. First of all, from his personal background, he grew up with positive Jewish influences, we can say. He had Jewish neighbors, Jewish teachers. He had even a Jewish judo coach. And early in his presidency, he maintained good relations with the Jewish communities. He fostered ties with Israel. Also, we should say that he was continuing the policies of his predecessors, Gorbachev and Yeltsin. But between his personal ties and his KGB legacy, he tends to opt for a latter. That's what we see in the last few years. Despite his personal experiences, Putin's worldview is shaped by his KGB service. And KGB and its predecessors, organizations, viewed Jews as both a powerful force controlling the West and a potential internal threat to the Soviet state. Many experts indicate that the KGB perception of Jews was as of global manipulators, and within the KGB, anti-Semitic conspiracies were widely accepted, including the idea that Jews secretly control Western governments, finance, media. Those were their working assumptions. And as I already mentioned, that the Soviet intelligence circulated the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is one of the most famous or infamous conspiracies. They were circulating them in the Arab world to foster anti-Zionist sentiment and anti-Americanism. So Putin's growing reliance on Soviet-era intelligence tactics led him to use anti-Semitism as a tool in his war propaganda and anti-Western messaging. He may be personally not a Jewish, the in the framework of my research, I met with few people who know Putin personally, who meet with him. One of these conversations was with Natan Sharansky, very well-known dissident, Soviet dissident, who met with Putin in the 90s when Sharansky was already a minister in the Israeli government, and Putin was, I think, the head of the FSB, the successor of KGB. And one of the strongest impressions of Sharansky was that Putin is not anti-Semite. He is really he doesn't have it. But so this is what we talk when I this is what I mean when I say this kind of paradox or Jewish dilemma, being not personally anti-Semitic, but using anti-Semitism because it's good for your interest of your country. So this mythologized attitude toward Jews on the part of Putin and his KGB comrades is associated with their perception that the Soviet Union was defeated because of its confrontation with the Jewish world during the Cold War. In retrospect, many of them consider the Jewish policies of the KGB and the USSR as a strategic mistake. And Putin's position today reflects the attempt to avoid this mistake. So this is why it was so important for him from the very beginning of his rule to have strong Jewish allies. This is why he attracted the Chabad movement to his side, giving them the free rein to develop Jewish religious life in Russia. But Chabad in return is completely loyal to Putin and calls him a friend of the Jewish people, while ignoring Putin's anti-Semitic and revisionist statements that I just mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And by the way, this is the reason we don't hear a voice of Chabad Russia against the war in Ukraine. And more generally, Chabad's proximity to Kremlin today, I would say, casts doubt on the movement's ability to effectively counter anti-Semitism in Russia. Now, in concluding of my presentation, just a few remarks about public attitude in Russia, not the government, the public attitude, and the future of Jews and anti-Semitism in Russia. Uh, uh, for years, Russian public opinion showed declining hostility towards Jews. You may be familiar with Russian polls and surveys, public opinion institutes like Levada Center, and they clearly show this declining hostility towards Jews. The ideological anti-Semitism of various kinds impacted a very narrow layer of population and nationalist groups. And in the years preceding the invasion in Ukraine, experts believed that return to state-sponsored anti-Semitism was unlikely. Yet Russia's reversion to Soviet-type policies in the last years, specifically since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, full-scale war in Ukraine, and of course political repressions, and of course this isolation from the West and the reliance on security agencies changed these dynamics. Today, we see that Stalinist or KGB methods of disinformation have returned, and anti-Semitism once again became an official tool of this apparatus. And we see the normalization of anti-Semitic discourse in Russia, which occurred at a breakneck speed, which indicates, in my eyes at least, that anti-Semitism has never disappeared from the public sphere in Russia. In an article I wrote for the Institute of Contemporary Anti-Semitism in Indiana University a few months ago, I wrote that it's very difficult to predict what Putin's policies on Jewish and Israeli issues will be, given the very arbitrary and uncertain nature of affairs in Russia. And indeed, 4 months after I wrote this article, we see some changes already. On the one hand, Putin and his loyalists like Lavrov and others continue to express themselves in a very anti-Semitic manner in issues pertaining to Ukraine. As I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, even a few days ago, Lavrov's statement and Putin's statement about Zelensky. However, there are two things that changed. First, the Kremlin has reduced anti-Semitic attacks domestically. Why? Because it understands that the anti-Semitic riots in the North Caucasus or any other region for that matter have gotten out of control. And if there is one thing that Putin regimes hates, it is losing control. The second change in Russian authorities' behavior has to do with Israel. The anti-Israel rhetoric of the government and the media in Russia has diminished. The reason for this is related to a series of defeats suffered by Russia's allies in the Middle East, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Hamas suffered a serious blow, as did Hezbollah, which even begged for a ceasefire. In addition, Iran's missiles attacks on Israel led to an Israeli response that significantly damaged Iran's air defense systems that are based on Russian weapons. And so this demonstrated Israel's military superiority and highlighted the vulnerability of Iran and its nuclear program. And on top of all of this, Assad regime, who was an ally of Russia, fell suddenly, and the future of Russia's military bases in Syria, which was so important for geopolitical operations of Russia in Middle East and in Africa, is shrouded in uncertainty. So these developments have led to a moderation of anti-Israel sentiments and even to a certain Russian willingness to discuss Israel's ideas for new security arrangements in the region. The reduction in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric once again highlights the instrumental nature of the issue of anti-Semitism by the Russian government. Instrumental nature. Depending on the regime's needs in domestic or international arena, the Kremlin increases or decreases the degree or the level of anti-Semitism and tactically adapts it to target or different target audiences and the tasks at hand. And this resembles very closely the pattern that existed in the Soviet period and in Tsarist Russia, with one fundamental difference. In today's Russia, Jews constitute a small and shrinking population group, which no longer plays a central role in Russian life, social life, or politics. In this sense, we are approaching a situation of anti-Semitism without Jews. This is a phenomenon that is familiar from the history, including of Russia's history, if you look back to Ivan the Terrible. So as in the Soviet Union, as in the Tsarist Russia, in today's Russia, a combination of government policies, not only anti-Semitism, is pushing Jews out of the country. And my final sentence would be in my presentation before we'll open up for questions. When we look into all of these dynamics, it's very possible that the Jewish chapter of Russian history is coming to an end. Thank you for your attention.